Welcome to this journey into one of the most unsettling accounts ever whispered through the corridors of the American South. Before we begin, I want you to do something simple. Pause for a moment and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now where you are. There is something about stories like this, stories that travel across distance and time, that makes you wonder who else is hearing them and at what hour of the night or day they choose to listen. Because what you are about to hear is not just history. It is something that lingers, something that seems to wait, and perhaps something that still listens back. In the summer of 1844, along the humid banks of the Mississippi River, the city of Vicksburg moved as it always had. Steamboats groaned against the docks. Cotton bales were stacked in endless rows beneath the heavy sun. Men in linen coats conducted business beneath wide verandas, speaking in low voices about land, money, and ownership. It was a world built on order, on categories, on lines that were never meant to blur. Black and white, master and enslaved, human and property. Everything had its place. Everything made sense. Until, quietly, something entered that world that did not. At first, it was only whispers, nothing more than fragments of conversation carried between field hands, or exchanged in hushed tones between house servants when the doors were closed and the lamps burned low. Two women, twin sisters, they said, but not like any twins anyone had ever seen. Some claimed they had come from upriver. Others said they had no origin at all, that they simply appeared within the system as if they had always been there. No family name, no clear record, no past that anyone could trace with certainty. Only this: two women, always together, and never quite right. The first official record of their existence appears in a ledger, dry, formal, and strangely incomplete, a document from the Natchez auction house dated June 14, 1844. Most entries in such ledgers were detailed, painfully so. Height, age, physical condition, skills, temperament, all carefully noted to determine value. But this entry was different. Brief, almost hesitant, as if the person writing it did not wish to linger. It read, "Twin females, approximately 20 years of age, one of dark complexion, one of pale condition, origin unknown, sold as a single lot." And then, nothing. No further description, no elaboration. Only a final note written smaller than the rest. Price withheld. That alone would have been unusual, but when the record was uncovered decades later, hidden within private family papers, the truth of that price became known. $18,000. In 1844. To understand what that means, you have to place yourself in that time. A strong field hand might sell for $1,500, a highly skilled house servant, perhaps $3,000. $18,000 was not a purchase, it was an investment of obsession. A number so far beyond reason that it raised a question no one could answer. What could possibly make two enslaved women worth that much? Reverend Samuel Hutchkins happened to be present that day, a traveling Methodist minister passing through Natchez on his way north, a man who had seen auctions before, who had witnessed the cruelty of it, the routine of it, the quiet horror that had become ordinary. But even he would later write that what he saw that day was something else entirely. In his journal, he recorded, "I have witnessed many souls sold into bondage, but never have I seen a crowd fall into such silence as when these two women were brought forward." He described how they stood side by side, holding hands, not tightly, not in fear, but in a way that seemed deliberate, as if the contact between them was necessary, essential. And then there was their appearance. One, whom records would later name as Dahlia, possessed a complexion so dark it seemed to absorb the light around her. Not merely dark in the ordinary sense, but deep, almost luminous in its richness. Her eyes were darker still. So dark, Hutchkins wrote, that they did not reflect light the way human eyes should. They seemed to hold it, contain it. The other, Lily, stood beside her like a contradiction made flesh, her skin pale beyond anything natural. Not the pale of illness, but something closer to absence, like moonlight resting on water. Her hair white, not gray, not aged, but white as fresh cotton in the fields. And her eyes? A strange, shifting amber, sometimes gold, sometimes nearly colorless. Eyes that seemed to change depending on how the light touched them. Separate, they were striking. Together, they were something else. Hutchkins struggled to describe it. It was not merely the contrast, he wrote. It was the sameness, because their faces were identical. Every feature mirrored perfectly, the same structure, the same expression, the same stillness, as if someone had taken a single face and divided it into two opposing forms. But what unsettled him most was not how they looked. It was how they moved, or rather, how they did not move independently. When one shifted her weight, the other followed. When one turned her head, the other mirrored it. Not a second later, not a moment delayed, but at the exact same instant. Perfect synchronization, as though they were not reacting to each other, but being guided by something shared. The crowd noticed it too. At first, there were murmurs, quiet speculation. Then, silence. A kind of silence that spreads without instruction, the kind that settles over people when something cannot be explained but is deeply felt. No one laughed. No one called out bids immediately. Even the auctioneer hesitated, if only for a moment. Hutchkins would later write, "They did not plead. They did not weep. They did not resist. They simply watched. And I had the terrible sensation that they were not observing us as individuals, but as something else entirely, as though we were the ones being examined." When the bidding finally began, it rose quickly, too quickly, as if those present felt an urgency they could not explain, a need to either possess or be rid of whatever stood before them. And when it ended, the twins were sold together, never separated, not even in transaction. Purchased through an intermediary for the Belmont family, a name that carried weight throughout Mississippi, a family known not only for wealth, but for influence, land, politics, connections that reached far beyond the river. Whatever decision they made was rarely without purpose. And yet, even among those who knew the Belmonts, the purchase raised questions. Why pay so much? Why acquire something so unusual? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what did they believe they were buying? Because by the time the twins left that auction block, the whispers had already begun to change. No longer just curiosity, No longer just rumor, but something closer to unease. Some said the air around them felt different, heavier. Others claimed there was a scent, faint at first, barely noticeable, like two different flowers carried on the same breeze. One sweet, dark, almost intoxicating. The other light, clean, and distant. And when those scents blended together, something about it felt wrong. Not unpleasant, but not natural. And then there were the dogs. Men who worked the yards would later recall how even the most aggressive animals, the ones bred to fight, would react strangely when the twins passed. They would lower themselves, whine, avoid eye contact, as though faced with something they could not understand, but instinctively feared. By the time the carriage carrying Dahlia and Lily disappeared down the road, bound for the Belmont estate, the feeling had settled into something unmistakable. Not fear, not yet, but the quiet beginning of it. Because in a world where everything had its place, where every person could be defined, measured, categorized, these two women did not fit. They did not behave as two individuals. They did not move as two individuals. And to those who had stood close enough to meet their gaze, they did not feel like two individuals. They felt like something else. Something divided. Something incomplete. Something that did not belong in separate forms. And though no one spoke it aloud, though no record would state it plainly, the thought lingered, unspoken, unwritten, but impossible to ignore. What if they were never truly two to begin with? And what made these two women worth more than anyone could explain would soon terrify everyone who came near them. The Belmont estate stood apart from everything around it, not just in size, though it was vast, not just in wealth, though few families in Mississippi could rival it, but in presence. There are houses that simply exist, and then there are houses that seem to watch. The Belmont Mansion was the latter. Set on more than 15,000 acres of fertile land outside Vicksburg, the estate overlooked the slow, heavy movement of the Mississippi River. From the distance, it appeared as a symbol of Southern power, white columns rising against the sky, wide verandas wrapped in shadow, windows that caught the light during the day and reflected nothing at night. Everything about it suggested order, control, dominance over land, over labor, over life itself. The Belmont family had built that control over generations. Cotton, politics, and carefully maintained alliances had secured their place among the most powerful names in the region. Their influence extended beyond plantations, into courtrooms, into banking houses in New Orleans, even into the quiet corridors of decision-making in Washington. When the Belmonts made a move, it was rarely without calculation. Which is why the arrival of Dahlia and Lily did not go unnoticed, not by the family, not by the servants, and certainly not by the house itself. They arrived in the late afternoon, the sun low, heavy, casting long shadows across the grounds. A carriage rolled through the gates, its wheels grinding against the dirt path. Inside, the twins sat together, as always, hands touching, not tightly, but enough. Servants gathered at a distance, not openly watching, but watching nonetheless, because word had already spread ahead of them. Two women, one dark as night, one pale as moonlight, and something about them not right. When the carriage door opened, neither sister moved immediately. For a moment, they simply sat, still, silent, as if waiting, not for permission, but for something else entirely. Then, together, they stepped down, at the exact same time, their feet touching the ground in perfect unison, their posture identical, their gaze lifting toward the house, as though they were seeing it not as a place, but as something to be understood. One of the house servants would later recall, "It wasn't like they was looking at the house. It was like they was looking through it." From the very beginning, something about their arrival disrupted the natural rhythm of the estate. Small things, difficult to explain, easy to dismiss, but impossible to ignore once noticed. Conversations would falter when they passed, not because they spoke, but because of the silence they carried with them, a silence that seemed to press outward, filling the space around them. Some servants claimed that when the twins walked through a room, the air felt heavier afterward. Others said it felt lighter, as though something had been removed or transferred. And then there was the scent. Faint at first, almost imagined, but present. Always present. Two fragrances, distinct yet intertwined. One deep and sweet, like flowers that bloom only at night. The kind that release their scent slowly, thickly, filling the darkness. The other, light, clean, almost sharp, like something touched by morning air. Individually, they were pleasant, but together, there was something about the combination that unsettled the senses. Not enough to repel, but enough to disturb. The Belmont family did not welcome the twins into the main household, not in the way other enslaved individuals might be brought into service roles. There were no assignments given, no tasks explained, no integration into the routines of the house. Instead, preparations had already been made, quietly, deliberately. The third-floor east wing. A section of the mansion that had once been used for storage, long corridors, high ceilings, few windows, and only a single access point. A narrow hallway ending in a heavy wooden door. That door remained locked, always. The twins were escorted there immediately upon arrival. No introductions, no ceremony, only instruction. And even those instructions were given at a distance, as though proximity itself carried risk. Inside that wing, 2 rooms had been prepared, identical in size, mirroring each other across a central wall. Simple furnishings, beds, chairs, a single window in each room. At first, the arrangement seemed almost generous. Private space, separation from the harsher conditions experienced elsewhere on the plantation. But that impression did not last, because the door between the rooms was locked from the outside, and the corridor leading to them was guarded. This was not accommodation. This was containment. The servants understood it immediately, even if no one said it aloud. Something about these women required distance, required control, required barriers. And yet, even within those barriers, the strange occurrences began. It started with movement, or rather, the absence of independent movement. Servants tasked with delivering food would report the same thing every time, without exception. The twins would be positioned in their rooms in the same posture, facing the same direction, often standing, sometimes sitting, but always mirroring each other. And when one shifted, the other did as well. At first, it was assumed they were simply copying one another, a habit, a learned behavior. But over time, that explanation became harder to accept, because the synchronization was too precise, too immediate. No delay, no adjustment, no correction, as though the movement did not originate in 2 separate bodies, but in a single shared impulse. One servant would later say, I tried watching just one of them to see who moved first, but I couldn't tell. It was like the movement didn't start anywhere. It just happened. Then came the silence. They spoke rarely, almost never to the servants, and when they did, it was brief, measured. But more often, they communicated without words. A glance from one followed by a reaction from the other, immediate, accurate, as though something had passed between them, unseen. And when separated, even by the locked door, something changed. It began subtly, a shift in breathing, a restlessness. Then it grew. Servants reported hearing sounds at night, not loud, not violent, but persistent. A soft calling, voices, two voices, calling for each other. Not in panic, but in need. And the longer they remained apart, the more intense it became. By the second week, the Belmont family could no longer ignore it. It was not just unsettling, it was disruptive. The house itself seemed affected. Lights flickered, doors creaked open without cause, clocks stopped, then resumed. Nothing dramatic, nothing undeniable, but enough. Enough to create tension, enough to create fear. It was at this point that Dr. William Ashford was summoned. Ashford was not a superstitious man. He was a physician of reputation, educated, methodical, a man who believed in observation, diagnosis, and explanation. He had treated members of the Belmont family for years, handled everything from minor ailments to serious conditions. He was not easily disturbed, which is why his reaction to the twins would later be described as troubling. He arrived on a warm August morning. The house felt different that day, quieter. Even the servants spoke in lowered voices. Ashford was led upstairs, through the main floors, past the rooms where life still moved as expected, and then into the east wing. The air changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. He would later struggle to describe it. It was not unpleasant, he wrote, but it was unfamiliar. The door was unlocked. The guard stepped aside. And for the first time, a physician entered that space with the intention of understanding what stood within it. The twins were brought together for examination. That alone caused immediate reaction. Their breathing shifted, their posture adjusted, and when they stood side by side, the effect was undeniable. Ashford noted it immediately. The visual contrast was striking, he wrote. But what was more remarkable was the sense that the contrast itself was incomplete. He began with routine observations, pulse, respiration, reflexes. Standard procedure. But nothing about what followed was standard. When he examined Dahlia's pulse, it was slow, approximately 48 beats per minute. He instructed his assistant to examine Lily at the same time. The result? Identical. Not just in rate, but in rhythm. The beats occurred simultaneously, perfectly synchronized. Ashford repeated the measurement multiple times. Each time, the same result. 2 separate bodies, 2 separate hearts, beating as one. He moved to reflex testing. A simple stimulus, a light tap. Dahlia reacted. At the exact same instant, Lily reacted as well. Even when the stimulus was applied only to one. Ashford frowned. He separated them, placed them in different rooms, closed the door. And then, everything changed. Their breathing became rapid, their movements restless. And then, the sounds began. Calling. each calling for the other. Not loudly, not violently, but with a growing urgency that filled the space between the walls. Ashford noted, the distress was immediate and severe. And yet, even in that distress, their physiological responses remained synchronized. He measured again. Heart rate elevated, but identical. Breathing rapid, but identical. Even separated, they remained connected. Ashford attempted to continue the examination, but something had shifted. Not just in them, in him. He would later write, I found their presence difficult to endure. Not because of behavior, not because of threat, but because of the way they looked at him. When both sets of eyes turned toward him, one dark, one pale, but both carrying the same expression. It created a sensation he could not explain. As though I was being observed from two perspectives at once. He ended the examination sooner than planned, not out of necessity, but out of discomfort. And as he left the East Wing, stepping back into the familiar air of the main house, he paused, just briefly, as if something had followed him, or remained with him. And in his final report, he recorded the facts, the synchronization, the shared responses, the inexplicable connection. But at the very end, he added a note, a deviation from clinical language, a confession. I cannot explain what I have observed, and I am no longer certain that I have examined two separate individuals. By the time the doctor left that house, he was no longer certain he had examined two people at all. By the autumn of 1844, the story had begun to move beyond the walls of the Belmont mansion. At first, it had been contained, confined to corridors, locked behind doors, whispered only among those who had no choice but to remain close to it. But things like this do not stay contained for long. It began with the servants, not openly, not in ways that could be traced, but in fragments, in looks exchanged across rooms, in pauses during conversation, in words spoken only when they were certain no one else could hear. Among them was an elderly woman named Claudia. She would not be formally interviewed until decades later, long after the events had passed into memory. But when she spoke, her words carried the weight of someone who had seen something she never fully understood. They wasn't like other twins, she said. Not even close. We seen twins before, but these two... She paused before continuing. They wasn't two people. Claudia had worked on a neighboring plantation, close enough to the Belmont estate that news traveled easily. Close enough that sometimes servants moved between properties, carrying stories with them. She described the first time she saw the twins, from a distance, through a window, standing side by side. At first I thought my eyes was playing tricks on me, she said, because I saw one dark and one light. But then I looked closer, and I realized they was the same. Not similar, not resembling, the same. And it wasn't just their faces. It was the way they stood, she said. The way they looked out, like they wasn't looking at nothing in particular, but everything at once. Claudia was not alone in her observations. Another account came from a man named Isaiah, a house servant who worked within the Belmont estate itself. His testimony, recorded years later, carried a different tone, less reflective, more immediate. They kept them upstairs, he said. Didn't let nobody near 'em unless they had to. Food went up, trays came back down, but nobody stayed long. When asked why, he answered simply, "You didn't want to." Isaiah described the feeling of walking that hallway, the east wing, the door. You could feel it before you even got there, he said, like the air got thicker, like something was waiting. But what stayed with him most was not what he saw. It was what he smelled. Two smells, he said. Always two. He struggled to describe them. One was sweet, but not like normal flowers. Darker than that, like it had weight to it. And the other was light, clean, like morning. Individually, they were almost pleasant, but together, they didn't belong together, he said, but they was always together. And when those scents mixed, it made something else, something he could not name, something that made your stomach turn, but made you want to breathe it in at the same time. This phenomenon, the dual fragrance, began to appear in multiple accounts. At first, only within the house. Then, beyond it. Servants working in the fields would report catching the scent on the wind. Brief, faint, and then gone. Even when the twins had not left the mansion, even when they were known to be locked in their rooms. It did not make sense. But by now, very little did. And then came the visitors. The Belmont family continued to host dinners, gatherings, meetings. Outwardly, nothing had changed. But those who attended began to notice things. Subtle at first. A guest might pause mid-conversation, as though distracted. Another might glance toward a hallway, though nothing was there. And then, the scent. Judge Marcus Bellamy was one of the first to record it. A man of reason, a man of law, not easily influenced by superstition. In his private diary, he wrote, "Throughout the evening, I became aware of an unusual fragrance, two distinct scents appearing in different parts of the house." He described moving from room to room. In one space, the darker scent, heavy, lingering. In another, the lighter one, almost fleeting. But as the night progressed, they began to merge. "I cannot adequately describe the effect," he wrote, "but it was disorienting." At one point, he mentioned it to Charles Belmont. The reaction was immediate. A shift in expression, a tightening. And then, the change of subject. Bellamy did not press further, but in his diary, he added a final line. "There is something in that house that does not wish to be spoken of." By now, the unease had begun to take shape. Not just curiosity, not just discomfort, but something closer to fear. And it was no longer confined to those who saw the twins. It was spreading into thought, into perception, into the quiet spaces of the mind. Which is why, when the Belmont family decided to seek spiritual counsel, they did not choose lightly. They sent for Reverend Thaddeus Price, a man known for his certainty, a Baptist minister with a reputation for discipline, for clarity, for unwavering belief in the order of the world. If there was something unnatural at work, he would recognize it. Or, so they believed. He arrived on a cold morning in November. The house greeted him as it had greeted others. Still, quiet. quiet. But he would later write that from the moment he crossed the threshold, he felt something watching him. Not from a single point, but from multiple directions at once. He was led to the east wing. The door opened, and for the first time, he saw them. Dahlia and Lily, seated together, hands intertwined, their posture composed, their expressions calm, waiting. He described the moment in his diary. The contrast between them was immediate and deeply unsettling. One dark as night, one pale as death, and yet identical in every feature. He approached cautiously, introduced himself, attempted conversation. At first, there was silence. Then, Dahlia spoke, her voice low, measured. "Reverend," she said, "you speak of sin." A pause. Then Lily, her voice higher but perfectly aligned in rhythm. "And of salvation." And then, together, "But what if there are souls that exist outside of both?" The effect was immediate. Price would later write, "Their voices, though separate, created a single sound, as though two notes had merged into one." He continued the discussion, attempted to guide it, but something was wrong, deeply wrong. Because as they spoke, he began to feel something, not in the room, but in his mind. Memories, unbidden, sudden. His brother, dead 20 years. An argument with his wife, words he had never spoken aloud again, moments he had buried, hidden. And yet, they surfaced, not gently, but with force, as though pulled upward. He wrote, "I had the terrible sensation that they were seeing what I remembered, that they were not listening to my words, but to my thoughts." He ended the meeting quickly, but the encounter did not end with the room, because something had followed him, or perhaps something had entered him. 2 days later, he stood at the pulpit, prepared to deliver a sermon, a familiar one, on resisting temptation. He began as he always did, but then something shifted. His words changed, not gradually, suddenly. "I heard myself speaking," he wrote, "but the words were not mine." He said, "Do not resist it, for it is already among us, walking in two forms, seeing with 4 eyes." The congregation sat in silence. No one moved. No one spoke, because what they heard was not the voice they knew. Price stopped, abruptly. He could not continue. He left the pulpit, and he never returned. Within weeks, he resigned. His wife would later write, "He wakes at night in terror. He speaks of mirrors and shadows and twins who are not truly twins. He says something is wrong with the world, that there are things walking in it that should not be." By now, the story had changed. No longer confined to whispers, no longer limited to observation. It had begun to affect people, their thoughts, their dreams, their sense of reality. And those who encountered the twins did not leave unchanged. Because whatever these sisters were, they were no longer just being observed. They were beginning to affect the world around them. By the summer of 1845, The Belmont family had exhausted every explanation that felt safe. Physicians had observed, clergy had intervened, servants had whispered, guests had noticed. And yet, nothing had brought clarity. Only escalation. Whatever Dahlia and Lily were, they were no longer a curiosity. They were a problem. Not one that could be discussed openly, but one that demanded resolution. Which is why the Belmonts turned to a different kind of authority. Not faith, not local medicine, but science. They sent word to New Orleans, and from there further still, until they secured the services of a man whose reputation extended beyond the American South. Dr. Adrian Rowley, a physician trained in Europe, a man familiar with emerging theories of physiology, magnetism, and the hidden connections within the human body. He was not easily impressed, not easily frightened, and most importantly, he did not believe in superstition. When he arrived at the Belmont estate in June of 1845, he came with a purpose: to explain, to reduce what others had described as impossible into something measurable, understandable, contained. He kept a journal, detailed, precise. At first, subjects, female twins approximately 20 years of age, he wrote. Marked contrast in pigmentation, otherwise identical in structure. He referred to them clinically, objectively, but even in his earliest notes, there were hints of something else. Initial observation suggests an unusually strong sympathetic bond, he wrote, possibly psychological in origin. He believed he understood what he was seeing, at least in the beginning. The examinations began immediately, controlled, structured. Rowley insisted on separating them, not out of caution, but necessity. If there was a connection, it needed to be measured, tested, defined. The first separation lasted only minutes. It was enough. He recorded, upon separation, both subjects exhibited immediate physiological distress. Heart rate increased rapidly. Respiration became labored. Nothing unusual in isolation. But then, despite physical separation, their vital signs remained synchronized. Perfectly. As though distance meant nothing. Rowley repeated the test, increased the distance, placed them in separate rooms, ensured no visual contact, no sound, no physical awareness. And still, the same result. 2 bodies, 1 response. He began to consider possibilities: shared trauma, conditioned behavior, but none of them explained the precision, the immediacy, the absence of delay. It was not reaction. It was simultaneity. And then he moved further, into experimentation. His entry, dated June 28th, describes the first procedure that would alter everything. Blood. He drew a sample from Dahlia, measured, controlled, and then introduced it into Lily. Carefully, watching for rejection, for signs of incompatibility. There were none! Not only did Lily accept the blood without resistance, her vital signs began to change, to align more precisely than before. Rowley noted, the synchronization between subjects appears to intensify following transfusion. He repeated the process, this time reversing it. Blood from Lily into Dahlia. The result? Identical. The connection strengthened, not weakened, not disrupted, but reinforced, as though what flowed between them was not foreign, but shared. Rowley paused his writing that evening. When he resumed, his tone had shifted. I must consider the possibility that the subjects do not possess entirely separate physiological systems. A careful sentence, measured, but beneath it, something else had begun. Doubt. He continued. Days passed. Experiments expanded. Observation deepened. And with each step, the boundaries between them blurred further. He tested reflexes again. Stimulus applied to one, response observed in both. He tested sensory perception. A sound introduced in one room. Both reacted, even when the other could not possibly hear it. Even when there was no physical pathway for the information to travel. Rowley began to write differently. Less certainty, more questions. And then came the moment that would change everything. July 15th, 1845. His entry begins abruptly. I have begun to experience disturbances. Not in the subjects, in himself. Dreams, vivid, unavoidable. He described them in detail. I see through 4 eyes, he wrote, 2 perspectives merging into one. He experienced the world from both positions at once, not switching between them, not alternating, but simultaneously. He was Dahlia, he was Lily, and yet he was also himself. Observing both, understanding something he could not fully articulate. They are not separate, he wrote. They are divided. The distinction mattered deeply, because separation implies independence. Division implies something broken, something that once existed as one. He could not ignore it anymore. The theory formed slowly, reluctantly, but once it took shape, it would not leave. One consciousness, he wrote, distributed across 2 bodies. He tested it directly. He asked them to speak at the same time, different words. Dahlia said, "We are." Lily said, "One soul." But what Rowley heard was not 2 voices. It was something else. A third phrase formed between them. We are one soul, divided. He froze, because neither had spoken those exact words. And yet, that was what he heard. He asked them again. They smiled, not separately, together. And Dahlia said, "Perhaps you heard what lies between us." Lily continued, "Perhaps you heard what we are." Rowley did not record what he felt in that moment, but the next entry suggests it clearly. I fear that I have crossed a boundary, not in knowledge, but in understanding. From that point forward, his notes changed, shorter, more fragmented, as though something was interfering with the act of writing itself. And then, the mirror. August 18th. A simple observation, or so he believed. He positioned them together, side by side, in front of a mirror. At first, nothing unusual. 2 reflections, 2 figures, as expected. But then, something shifted. Not in them, in the reflection. Rowley described it carefully. The boundary between the 2 images became indistinct. Edges blurred, contrast softened. And for a brief moment, the mirror did not show 2 individuals. It showed one. A single figure, neither fully dark nor fully light, but something in between. A composite, an impossibility. He stepped closer. The image snapped back, 2 figures again, separate. But he had seen it. He knew what he had seen, and he could not dismiss it. That night, he did not sleep. The following entry is brief, unsteady. I believe they are attempting to become whole. He underlined the word attempting twice, because what followed was realization and fear. If this process completes, I do not know what will result. And then his final entry. August 20th. I am leaving. No further study is possible. The subjects are not what they appear to be. They are not twins. They are fragments of something that was never meant to exist in separate forms. And then the warning, clear, urgent. Keep them apart. Do not allow prolonged contact. And under no circumstances should they be permitted to stand together before a mirror. Because in that reflection, they are already one. Rowley left that day, without ceremony, without explanation. He did not return to New Orleans. He did not return home. 6 days later, his body was found in a swamp outside Vicksburg. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence. The official report listed drowning, accidental. But the details did not align. The body had decomposed unusually fast, faster than expected. And then, the eyes. One had darkened, almost black. The other had become pale, nearly colorless, as though something had altered him, even in death. The Belmont family received the news in silence. They did not question it, not publicly. But privately, they acted, immediately. New rules were established, strict, enforced without exception. The twins were no longer allowed to touch. Their rooms were separated. The connecting door locked permanently. Mirrors were removed, every reflective surface eliminated. And most importantly, they were never allowed to stand together in the same light, especially not sunlight. Because by now, the Belmonts understood something. Not fully, but enough. Enough to be afraid. Because what Rowley had seen, what he had warned them about, was no longer theoretical. It was happening. Slowly. Inevitably. And then came the warning no one followed. Never let them become one. By the spring of 1846, the Belmont mansion no longer felt like a place meant for the living. It still stood, still functioned. Meals were served, business was conducted. Guests were received, though far fewer now. But beneath that surface, something had shifted. The rules had been put in place. Strict separation, no contact, no mirrors, no shared light. And for a time, it seemed to work. The disturbances lessened. The house grew quieter. The scent faded, though never completely. And yet, there was a tension that never left. Because everyone inside that house understood one thing. Even if no one dared to say it aloud. This was not a solution. It was a delay. something was still happening. Slowly, quietly, but inevitably.
April 30th, 1846.
The day had been heavy from the beginning. The air thick, unmoving. Clouds gathered early, dark and low, pressing down on the land as though something vast was waiting just beyond sight. By evening, the storm began. Not gradually, suddenly. Wind tore through the trees, rain struck the ground in sheets, thunder rolled across the sky in long, continuous waves that seemed less like sound and more like something breaking. Inside the Belmont mansion, doors were secured, windows latched, servants moved quickly, quietly. No one lingered in the hallways. Because storms in that part of Mississippi were not uncommon. But this one felt different. There was a pressure in the air, not just from the weather, but from something else, something building. The east wing remained locked, as it always was. 2 guards stationed at the entrance, men chosen not just for strength, but for reliability. They had been given clear instructions. No one enters, no one leaves. And above all, the twins must remain separated. Throughout the evening, everything held. Until just past midnight. No one could later agree on the exact time, only that it happened suddenly. The storm reached its peak. Thunder cracked so violently it seemed to split the sky itself. And then, something else. Not thunder, not wind, but a sound, low, resonant, as though 2 tones had collided and become one. It lasted only a moment, but every person in the house felt it, not in their ears, but in their chest. A vibration, deep, unnatural. And then, silence. The storm did not stop, but for a brief instant, it seemed distant, muted, as though something closer had taken its place. When the servants reached the east wing, they found the guards on the floor. All 3, unconscious, not injured, not bleeding, but collapsed, their faces frozen, not in pain, but in something else. Terror, pure, unfiltered. It took several minutes to revive them, and when they woke, they could not explain what had happened. At first, they spoke in fragments, broken sentences. But one phrase repeated over and over. They merged. No matter how many times they were questioned, no matter how carefully, the answer did not change. They merged. The door to the east wing was open, unlocked from the inside. That alone was impossible, but it was only the beginning. Inside, the hallway stood empty, still. No sound, no movement. The rooms were open, both of them. And inside, nothing. No sign of struggle, no indication of escape, no broken windows, no forced doors, only absence. Dahlia and Lily were gone. At first, it seemed simple. They had escaped somehow, but that explanation did not hold, because of what was found between the rooms. On the wall, the dividing wall, there was a mark. At first glance, it resembled a scorch, as though something had burned against the surface. But when they looked closer, it was not uniform, not entirely dark, not entirely light. The color shifted, depending on the angle. sometimes appearing charred, sometimes pale, almost luminous. And its shape was not random. It suggested a form, a human form, but not one, two, overlapping, merging, becoming something else. No one touched it. No one could, because standing near it produced a sensation difficult to describe. A pressure, a distortion, as though the space itself was not entirely stable. And then there were the rooms. Dahlia's room, the darker one, had changed. Subtly, but undeniably. The walls appeared lighter, the furniture less defined, as though something of the darkness had been removed or transferred. And Lily's room, the opposite. Shadows deeper, edges sharper, a weight in the air that had not been there before. It was as though each space had taken on a trace of the other, as though something had passed between them and altered both. Search parties were organized immediately. Men sent into the surrounding land, into the woods, along the river. Rewards offered, questions asked. But no trace was found. No footprints, no witnesses. Nothing. Except reports. At first dismissed, then repeated, then impossible to ignore. Sightings. A figure at the edge of a field, sometimes dark, sometimes pale, sometimes both. Seen at twilight, always at twilight. Standing, watching. Not approaching, not fleeing, just present. And then, gone. One planter claimed he saw two figures standing apart, slowly walking toward each other, and as they did, they became less distinct, blurring, until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. And then they were gone. Another account described a single woman, but her appearance shifted, dark one moment, light the next, as though both existed within her at once. And then there were the more disturbing reports. A traveler on the Natchez Road, dusk, he saw her standing at the roadside, approached cautiously. And as he drew near, he realized something was wrong. Her face contained more than one expression. Her eyes, 4, too dark, too pale, all focused on him. He turned away, looked back. She was gone, leaving only the scent. That same scent. 2 fragrances merged. Years passed. The Belmont family declined, gradually, quietly. Charles Belmont died in 1848, his final days marked by delirium. Speaking of shadows, of merging, of something that had been allowed to happen. Margaret withdrew from society. The mansion stood, but empty, avoided. Stories grew, passed down, changed, but never disappearing. Through the late 1800s into the early 1900s, the sightings continued. A figure at the edge of vision, a scent in the air, a presence that could not be fully seen, but could be felt. And always the same impression. Not two, not separate, but something combined. Something that had crossed a boundary. In 1962, when the mansion was finally scheduled for demolition, workers entered the East Wing. It had been sealed, bricked over, as though someone had wanted to ensure it remained untouched. Inside, the rooms were preserved, almost exactly as they had been, and the mark on the wall remained unchanged. Or perhaps not entirely. Some workers claimed it shifted, not visibly, but at the edge of perception, as though it did not belong entirely to the surface it marked. And beneath the floorboards, they found something else, a small wooden box. Inside, 2 locks of hair, one black, one white, intertwined so completely that they could not be separated. Tied together, black ribbon, white ribbon, each bound to the other. When the box was opened, the scent returned, stronger than anyone expected, filling the room, forcing some to step back, others to leave entirely. The hair was preserved, studied, and the results raised more questions than answers, because both samples carried identical genetic markers, as though they had come from the same individual. Not 2, 1. And even now, the stories have not ended. They have only changed form. Modern accounts exist, quietly shared. A reflection in glass, a figure behind where no one stands. A scent in the air with no source, and a feeling of being observed, not by one presence, but by something that sees from more than one perspective at once. Perhaps the final words belong not to science, not to records, but to those who simply encountered it. An entry written in a visitor log years later. I saw her in the reflection. Or them. I could not tell. She was both, and neither. And when I turned, there was nothing there. Only the scent and the feeling that something had become whole. They were never truly 2, and perhaps they were never meant to remain apart.